The year is 1655, and the Netherlands, a small country in the northwest of Europe, is in the midst of a golden age. The tiny nation coordinates the world's largest commercial fleet and is shipping more trade tonnage than all its European competitors combined. In this episode, you will be joining a ship of the VOC fleet to head to the East Indies. Will the reality of that voyage match up with the adventurous journey you have in your mind's eye? Your name is Piet van Westen, and you were born in a small village just north of Rotterdam. You and your two brothers and one sister live on a small dairy farm. Unlike them, though, you've never been satisfied with the daily grind of farming life, the early rises to milk the cows, feed the other animals, clean their living spaces, and tending the vegetables. Not for you. And then early to bed to start the entire process over and over again. While they stood in the fields, focused with the tasks at hand, you would look off into the horizon, daydreaming at the wonders that lay beyond the flat land stretching far into the distance. You had heard tales about the ships that sailed off to the eastern seas where the weather was said to be sun-filled all year round, and the VOC sailors who were able to see firsthand those wonders. You had so many questions. How could the sun shine warm all year round in trees that didn't shed their leaves, or people said to be darker than sand? You were obsessed. You were going to find the answer to these questions. You were going to voyage east. These were odd thoughts at first, between farming duties, then an almost constant trickle, a companion to while away the dark, short, monotonous hours of December in the Netherlands. On the eve of your 18th birthday, you gathered the nerve to approach your father to ask permission to join the fleets. His reaction was not anger, but fear, and then scorn, something you hadn't expected. He had heard about parents informing that their sons had not survived the trip. In fact, more accounts of those not surviving than those who had. You pleaded your point that those were just tales to scare others so that those going could hoard the riches for themselves. Besides, you would bring back enough wealth to ensure payments to all your father's creditors. But he would not budge, telling you that if you left, there would be no place here for you to welcome you back. And if you were insistent, well, you would need to leave now. Believing your father would never turn away the riches you would bring back, you packed your belongings, such as they were, and headed north towards Amsterdam. A coach ride through the flat polder farming lands which stretched north as far as you could see, and then a night's lodging at a roadside inn before finally, the next day, seeing the first bricks of Amsterdam's outlying buildings, and nestled at its center, the bustling city of Amsterdam. The city you are passing through is full of activity. Merchants on the street side with their organized market stalls, residential areas where many Dutch wives can be seen sweeping fastidiously with their brooms. You then pass through a more densely crowded market area. Estimating you are several blocks from the Amsterdam VOC headquarters. As you plod slowly through the streets to reach your destination, you are intercepted by a well-dressed man wearing the type of city clothes you would rarely see visiting your small town a few times per year. He introduces himself as Henk and asks where you are headed. You tell him of your desire to sign with the VOC fleet as a sailor helper. His eyes light up, and he tells you that your meeting him could not have been more fortuitous, for he happens to represent the VOC's recruitment arm, and he can streamline the process for you and guarantee you a placement on board one of the ships. He tells you that on your own it will be practically impossible to gain a spot with the fleet, but sign with him would ensure placement, all for just a small tributary fee in the form of an IOU. As if sensing your apprehension, he then regales you with wonderful stories of life at sea and the riches to be had in the east, jewels just laying strewn around for the taking, as were the comely ladies who were everywhere. Not only that, but he would provide you with food and lodgings until boarding time, and provide you with more information on the wealth you'd be bringing back with you at the tail end of your journey, and how to best invest it upon your return. One thing you didn't have packed with you was a plan on where you would be staying until the ships leave in several weeks' time. And here was an opportunity to be given not only placement on board one of the ships, but food and lodgings until that boarding day. All for a fee that you likely would have had to pay anyways for food and lodgings. In addition, he informs you, he will be supplying you with your VOC necessities: chest, hat, pillow, horse blanket, and a trusty knife. You agree, and after signing are led away to the cold cellar of a nondescript 3-story building. You are told of the need to lie low until the day of sailing due to the physical harm possible from those jealous of you and wanting your place on the ship. The food you'd been promised is bland and lifeless, the better to prepare you for the rations on board the ship, he says. And you share the small cramped quarters with dozens of other men, and soon the smells and filth are almost unbearable, but the promise of riches and the fact that these days waiting will soon be over have you surrender to your situation and force each day to bleed into the next. One thing that makes the days quicker is the copious amounts of cheap grog he is plying you all with. You're given so much that the time passes by under a hazy fog, and each day blurs into the next. On a chosen set of mornings in December every year during most of the 17th and 18th centuries, Amsterdam was awoken by the insistent blare of trumpets, the shrill of pipes, and a steady yet compelling roll of drums. City folk lined the streets to witness the men shuffling through the narrow brick streets along the canal towards the source of the music. Hapless men, thin and dressed in filthy rags, and appearing white from weeks of confinement in stinking attics and cellars, ambled forth. Drunks, derelicts, out-of-work slum dwellers, and dreamy-eyed peasants and farmers. The well-nourished and comparatively tidy-looking men who led this ragtagged group through the streets were known as crimpers, or by the chillingly appropriate name of soul sellers. Their job, to provide the VOC with labor for a cut of the laborers' profits. Profits which would not be realized for the sailors until journey's end, but the crimpers, upon signing the men and getting them a seat, were given their share. As a result, the prospects were kept guarded under what could be argued were prison-like conditions, locked in cellars and attics, and provided with barely enough calories for a child to survive, let alone a grown man. The deceptively celebratory music and procession really amounted to nothing more than a funeral march for the men being brought towards almost certain death. And the statistics, well, they were grim indeed. A third of the men would not live to see the lowlands of their birth again. The reason many of the men were homeless drunks or dreamers, or the most down of the downtrodden, was that experienced Dutch seamen were well aware of the low survival rate in the trade to the Indies, and as a result, they preferred to work on fishing boats on ships plying European routes. And even though the conditions on these domestic ships were even more primitive at times than on the East India ships, the shorter voyages and temperate climate gave the sailors a reasonable chance of coming back alive. Compared to even English East India ships, the survival rate on board the Dutch ships was slightly lower. The crimpers and their associates needed to ensure their men made it on the rosters so as to get a cut of that pay, and if that meant keeping them drunk and imprisoned, that's exactly what they did. Finally, the day arrives that you and the others are to march towards the VOC buildings. Your host, Hank, has spent the morning plying you all with a much higher quality of drink than you've experienced these several weeks. Had this been available earlier during your stay, it would have made what felt like a prison sentence slightly more appealing. On standing for the first time this morning, you realize you can barely put one foot in front the other. Hank retells you what he's been telling you and the rest of the men all morning. You are to resort to whatever means to ensure you get in the building and a place on the ship, but not to quarrel with each other. Something doesn't make sense, and you start to question him about this, as you had agreed on prearranged spots, but you're simply too out of mental commission at this point to argue. As your shambling and half-dead group approaches the courtyard, you see several desperate men clinging from the windows of a second story and then dropping into the crowd of hundreds more each time the door opens to let another group of men in. Many of them breaking limbs and literally smashing their opportunity before it even gets started, only to see more climb up in desperation to take their place. After what feels like hours, you traverse the final 50 feet and have the door open to let you in, barely avoiding one of the men above plummeting down on you and your companions. You are then filed inside and enlisted for the minimum term of 5 years. Then, your first taste of realism, as the fantasy has clouded all else you have seen until this point. The recruiter receives 150 guilders. You knew he would be getting a share. You couldn't quite remember it was that high. And in addition, another 50 guilders for the room and board you had assumed were to be freely given to represent you. However, you've made it this far, so do not dispute any of these points. You are left with approximately 400 guilders that you will only see after the 5 years is complete. And so, before even starting, you feel for the first time as if you'd been fleeced before even setting foot on the ship. The last 2 nights in the cellar would be your last in Amsterdam before sailing off with the fleet to the lands you had so often dreamed about. Then the day you've been waiting for arrives. Sight of your first East India ship, and what a sight it is. Fully 3 times the length of the largest farm building you'd ever seen, and many, many times the height. You board, passing some of the ship's officers and a large emblazoned VOC logo and crest, down to just 1 level above the cargo hold into your main crew quarters. While the ship may be 3 times the length of the largest barn you've ever seen, there are also 3 times the amount of men crowded into the same space your farm would hold a single animal. The first thing that assails your senses is the strong smell of musty urine and human excrement, the kind you remember only smelling in the animal pens back home, but dare you say, even worse. The space not only cramped, fetid, and filthy, but gloomy, and you were in an almost constant state of low light visibility, as only a tiny bit of daylight made it through the cracks in the hull. The air so heavy the candles, your only source of light, often had trouble burning. Over the coming weeks, seasickness from men unaccustomed to the ocean would only add to the smell and filth with the buildup of their almost constant purging. A few, including yourself, tried to use the designated areas, but you were soon so sick and the purging so frequent that almost any free and open space became a designated area. After a couple of weeks, conditions decidedly worse than the dirtiest pen you'd ever had the displeasure of cleaning. The food, which was horrible the first few days, only got progressively worse. Breakfast, which was served at 7 o'clock, consisted of a gray, lifeless hot porridge cooked with prunes and covered with butter that only got more rancid as the voyage went on. Dinner at noon consisted of beef or pork so salty you couldn't identify fresh from rotten, which you and the others quickly decided was probably for the best. Alternating with the land meat was seafood in the form of dried haddock or hake, served with gray and mushy peas. Or beans. You were never quite sure which was which, and tried to hold in your sense of smell to minimize your sense of taste. Then at 6 p.m., finally supper served, which was simply a mixture of leftovers from the 2 previous meals. To wash it all down, you were provided with your daily grog allowance, which consisted of brandy or rum diluted with water, the effects of which provided almost enough of a haze to make all of the aforementioned meals stay down when the seasickness had subsided. Whether the seamen signed on in Amsterdam, London, or any other European port city, their fate was approximately the same. Life on board the East Indies ships was the definition of filthy, with men packed together in dark and squalid conditions. Vermin, worms, insects, a constant threat to the food stores, and eating them along with the meals became more of a frequent occurrence as the voyage went on. A typical 600-ton East India ship would leave port with roughly 150 men on board, carrying tons of bread, pickled pork, beef, peas, beans, wheat, cooking oil, alcohol, and even some delicacies like cheese, butter, honey, and sausage, but those were meant exclusively for the captain's table. They weren't the regular sailor's fare, and anything fresh like fruit or vegetables on a long journey east was usually gone with the first 2 weeks at sea. As for the hygiene of the men themselves, well, their clothing swarmed with lice, which carried typhus, and the men constantly were either suffering from dehydration or dysentery, in addition to frequent bouts of scurvy. Every fantasy, every notion you had of the romance and adventure of sailing has been crushed under heel. You are easily the most miserable you've ever been. The farm and your memories of it, small bits of comfort you were able to conjure. While you haven't been seasick for a few weeks, you are still purging almost as much food back up as you're able to keep down. You have gotten used to the smells and sights, but are not sure if that is a good thing, as you felt the ability was one of the last things to separate you from the animals you once tended, and now resembled. Your ship soon enters the doldrums, and the heat is becoming unbearable. You are certain you will at some point during this journey meet the same fate as dozens of men around you have already. Death. Surely that would be more merciful than what this voyage has in store for you next. In the first episode, we detailed your life as Piet van Veste, son of a Dutch farming family from Gouderak, a farming community just north of Rotterdam. Disillusioned with life as a farmer and born with a wanderlust absent in your other kin, you always wondered what lay beyond the borders, beyond your country. You made your way to Amsterdam and the VOC in time for the annual fleet of ships bound for the East Indies. You encountered one of the crimpers, also known as a soul seller. In exchange for a portion of your wages, he found you placement on board one of the ships. Filling your head full of fantasy and the riches to be had was sufficient to reel you in. From the food, which you wouldn't have served your own farm animals, to the absolute filth and stench of the crew decks full of both ends of human purging, the first few weeks of the trip have been the definition of misery. Your ship has finally broken free of the doldrums off the west coast of Africa and is making its way towards the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope was inhabited by the Khoikhoi people when 2 VOC ships, the Dromedaris and Good Hope, landed there to build a way station. The way station was built to resupply VOC ships en route to the East Indies. Prior to the way station, many crew died en route to the Indies, dying from scurvy complications due to the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. The way station at the Cape, now named the Fort of Good Hope, would provide fresh fruits and vegetables to crew passing through. Jan van Linschoten procured maps from the Portuguese while serving as their viceroy's secretary in Goa between 1583 and 1588. Not only did he copy the maps, but he was able to provide nautical data like currents, deeps, islands, sandbanks, and coastal depictions to guide the way for future sailors. this stolen intelligence would form the foundation of the Dutch Republic's two-step plan to monopolize the spice trade. First, they would oust the Portuguese from their various island strongholds. Then, they would oblige local potentates to grant the Republic sole trading rights in exchange for protection. To achieve this, they required a large, massive, and versatile mercantile fleet, one that was also capable of waging war. Dutch windmills were the secret. They were the power, the saws that built the fleet. And as a result, the Republic was able to churn out ships in 1/3 the time of other competing nations, like the Spanish, Portuguese, and English. The ships and company, however, could only operate within the rights granted them. But for the VOC, those rights were all-encompassing. The VOC was given the right not just to create colonies and build forts, but to wage war. You are seated and eating the usual foul fare. The last week, you've had increasingly less of the drinking water, as it is now swarming with various organisms and smelling much like the mud water your pigs would roll around in. Rats and cockroaches have infiltrated much of the ship's food stores. Between their droppings and their body parts, the flavor of the foodstuffs no longer even approximate what the food was supposed to taste like. The announcement that you are nearing the Fort of Good Hope is welcome news indeed. For you and the rest of the crew, it's an opportunity to walk once again upon the land. One of your crewmates mentioned a wooden fort built during a previous trip to the Cape a few years earlier. Jan van Rijbeek led the construction and now commands the way station on behalf of the VOC. Having moored your ship nearby, you and your crew overnight at the fort. Inside its walls, living quarters, kitchens, council chamber, sickbay workshops, and storerooms. But it is outside the fort's walls, however, where you and the crew will spend most of your time. Here, shops and taverns of ill repute have sprung up, catering to all manner of vices. The brothel, of course, being one of them, and the gaming tavern, well, another. You enjoy the way station services and absolutely dread resumption of your voyage. But you do your best to remember each and every flavorful bite of every meal, and you store those memories to hopefully recall as soon you will again be forcing down the ship's gruel and hopefully keeping it down. Once the ship's stores are filled, your journey resumes. Before long, the pleasures of the fort are but a distant memory. While the food stores are more or less fresh for the first few days at sea, the creepy-crawly denizens you share the ship with waste little time in reasserting themselves in those food stores. The Dutch were very much the equivalent of Star Trek's fictional Ferengi, in that commerce was their driving motivation. The Dutch Republic was the global trading power during the majority of the 17th century. The VOC, founded by merchants for the sole purpose of monopolizing trade in the East at a profit for its investors. Religion played a very, very small part, and practically none in the company charter. When the Portuguese and other Christian European nations were kicked out of Japan for attempting to proselytize and support a Japanese Christian rebellion, the Dutch assisted the shogunate in putting down the rebellion. As a result, they were the only European power still able to conduct trade with Japan. The reason? They did not proselytize. They cared only for commerce and the ends needed to achieve maximum profitability. For them, the Japanese built an artificial island for exclusive trade with Japan. This relationship would prove mutually beneficial to both and remain so for another 213 years. As the days turn into weeks The Grim Reaper resumes his harvest of your fellow crewmen. You and the rest of the crew have little faith in the ship's surgeon, Jan van Pijn. He was a crooked man whom the crew suspected of hoarding poppy milk for personal consumption, as Pijn never seemed dulled for anyone else encountering him. But the surgeon himself, well, he always seemed to be in a daze and never subject to the horrors of the reality of the voyage. The horrible screams of crewmen in the surgeon's care deterred most from proactively seeking his medical attention. However, the surgeon was also the ship's dentist and its barber, so avoiding him entirely was a difficult proposition. The crew spoke about an English surgeon named Woodall and the form of surgeon's care that he introduced into the English company. A manual of his on ship care had been translated into Dutch, but it was clear based on the care the men on your ship received that it was either not in your surgeon's possession or being utterly ignored. Again, neither proposition offered much hope. Unfortunately, as much as you hoped you would not end up in his care, you fall extremely ill. At the height of the fever, you're unable to open your eyes and utter not so much as a sound. The surgeon, in his usual haze, assuming you are dead, is fetching a new shirt from your chest, which he will put on you. The sailmaker, standing nearby as you'd be handed off to him, to sew you up in an old sail and throw you unceremoniously overboard. Fortunately for you, as he was sewing the sail shut around you, you were able to open your eyes and make just enough of a sound for them to immediately stop and unwrap you. Had you been unable to do this, when you did, you'd be fathoms underwater and foodstuff for the denizens that dwelt there. Your duty on the ship alternates between light cleaning and repair work. Having worked with wood and metal on your farm has put you in the enviable position of being able to steer clear of some of the nastier cleaning duties. However, the weeks slowly trickle by and you do your best to lose yourself in the routine of this life on board the ship. Precious free time, though, has you planning your privilege. Privilege was afforded everyone, from the captain on down to the lowliest cabin boy. Privilege size and quantity was determined by rank. Privilege was an amount of personal space allotted for the crew to do personal trade. Providing the traded goods were not those of the monopoly the company traded in, crew members were free to bring back non-contraband items to trade and sell once back home. Of course, there were customs and duty applied, and as with any system, it was not only open to abuse, it was openly abused by all. While crew members could be threatened and have privilege removed east of the Cape out of fear of being left on some deserted isle, the officers and fellow crew members would have to proceed wisely once back in home waters, as revenge for past deeds was often doled out to officers and crew alike. Several more weeks at sea, and the announcement from the officers to the crew that Batavia was but a few weeks away. Your curiosity and hope that at least that part of the voyage would live up to the fantasy kept you going through the routine drudgery of the remaining days, and soon, as stated, you see your first glimpse of the Spice Islands. This concludes part 2 of the 3-part series of life as a sailor aboard a Dutch East Indies VOC ship. In the final part, Batavia and the return voyage will be covered, bringing the series to a close. So please leave comments on what you would like to see in a follow-up first-person series. I really have a lot of fun doing these. If you like this video, hit that like button, and if you haven't yet, but like the content, consider subscribing. Cheers. For a small nation in northwestern Europe, the 1600s were a golden age. You live in this nation known as the Republic of the United Provinces, which had willed itself into existence fighting against Spanish overlords. Armadas of windmills peppered the landscapes, draining polder lakes and converting those to agricultural land, leading to the expression that while a god may have created the world, the Dutch created the Netherlands. Their enemy, the Spaniards, then ruled by Philip II, ruled over the southern part of their lands, along with their Portuguese allies. Philip can be seen as the catalyst for the economic powerhouse that the VOC would become. He had restricted the Republic's access to trade in and or around their lands and removed the rebellious Republic's access to the northern distribution supply chain. This forced the Republic to look for the source of these spices and other trade goods in the Far East themselves. Had the Dutch been armed only with this intention, they might very well have struggled and even failed, but they were prepared, having spent the greater part of almost 2 decades secretly amassing maps and route information from Dutch sailors on board Portuguese ships. These maps would form the foundation of their East Indies empire. The tiny republic of just over 1.5 million people dominated world trade with a vast colonial empire and the largest fleet of merchantman ships of any nation. Merchantman ships built by the same windmills used to reclaim arable land pumped out ships with precisely cut timber in 1/4 of the time of competing nations. These were versatile ships that doubled as weapons of war. Fast, agile, and packing a powerful cannon punch, these vessels were the arms and legs of the VOC. You are Piet van Veste, a VOC sailor hoodwinked by crimps in Amsterdam to sail to the Dutch East Indies and back. This has been a steady dream of yours as you toiled away the long hours of life on a farm. However, survival chances were not in your favor. The voyage has so far taken many months, which has seen you experience the doldrums off the coast of West Africa, where your ship seemed to not make any headway for weeks on end. Food, on board, not much better, arguably worse than what you fed your farm animals back home. Many of your fellow crew members have died due to various causes associated with life on board the ship. A stop at the Cape of Good Hope did much to restore not only the ship's stores, but the morale of you and your fellow crewmen. Not to mention the wonderful distractions surrounding the Fort of Good Hope. We left off in part 2 with your ship spotting the land surrounding your destination of Batavia, which today is known as Jakarta and the area Indonesia. The VOC, adjusted for inflation, would be and was the most valuable company that has ever existed. To put this into perspective, in the 1600s, the VOC was worth 78 million Dutch guilders. Adjusted for inflation, that works out to about $7.9 trillion. Compare this against any of today's companies, well, that would be laughable, as the VOC would not only eclipse the majority of those companies, even lumped together with market cap to spare. To get an accurate comparison, its value was roughly equivalent to the GDP of modern-day Japan and Germany put together. However, one thing we have to be aware of is that the Dutch East India Company, much like the British, French, and others, drove their profits usually at the expense of the local populations that they were dealing with, certainly not leaving behind the best of legacies. Benefiting from this, the population of the Republic, which was 31.7% urbanized, again eclipsing any of the other nations by a fairly wide margin. Those in the Republic who invested in the VOC were treated to annual dividends that paid out almost 20% for close to 200 years. The sun here shines hotter than anything you've experienced back home in the Republic, or even the summer months could be filled with weeks of cold rain. You've been experiencing headaches on almost a constant basis. To avoid the sickness that usually accompanied drinking the onboard water, most sailors would stick to alcoholic beverages that are notorious for their ability to dehydrate the drinker. This, coupled with the hot sun, made those headaches the norm and not the exception. The trees surrounding Batavia are of the most vibrant green shades you've ever seen in your life. Not just one or two new shades, but dozens upon dozens belonging to a new, rich green palette of color. As your ship pulls into port, you get your first glimpse of the native population. Their skin, the same shade as that of the potatoes you grew back home. Their hair, overwhelmingly black, and their eyes had a slight almond shape to them. Drawing yet closer, you begin to hear their language, which is unintelligible to you, but sounds fairly melodic compared to the very guttural intonations of your birth language Dutch. During the offloading, you hear what you are told is a call to prayer. This results in the men here, much as the Moors you had learned about who used to inhabit the Iberian Peninsula, heeding their religion of Islam's time to pray. All around you, the men on small blankets face what one of your crew members tells you is the spiritual source of their religion. Far away, it is said, in a great desert near Persia. The heat of the sun still beats down upon you and your crewmates with relentless fury. It seems as if you are constantly breathing through a hot, wet blanket, and your skin is always moist to the touch. The houses that line the streets around you are built in the style of the houses back home in Holland. One of your crewmate friends named Wil van IJssel tells you that on a previous trip in 1647, most Dutchmen would have servants holding parasols to protect them from the sun and convey their status above the locals. The practice, however, has since been outlawed, in fact, the same year prior to his leaving back for Europe. Now, only the Governor General and his council members of the VOC and any wives that accompanied them could do this. However, this did not mean that most Dutchmen here did not flaunt a wealth they didn't have, because you note the most ostentatious dress and behavior you've ever seen, almost as if a squadron of peacocks was strutting about you. You and your fellow Dutchmen make up the minority of the population and are surrounded everywhere by much larger minorities of Chinese, Indian, and of course, local Indonesian population. While your skin color was the same shade as that of your pigs back home, among the minorities, shades ranged from the aforementioned potatoes to cinnamon and even coal. Never before had you seen such a diversity of peoples, as even Amsterdam, while a busy port city, only had a small group of these people visiting it from time to time. And Amsterdam for you was only a single visit or two annually. Some of the merchants and company employees had taken Indonesian or Chinese wives, including a few, it was said, that had other families back home. One such merchant you had been loading stores for, by the name of Pieter Knol, not only had married an Indonesian woman, but had 2 girls with her. He also had a large squadron of approximately 50 slaves to do his every bidding. Many laws would be passed limiting ostentatious displays of wealth and class difference, as the company wanted to avoid obvious signs of dominance and be seen not as colonists, but rather as traders, therefore different from the other European powers. In reality, however, the only impact the laws had were making them feel better about themselves, as the locals, well, they were generally not fooled. They knew the Dutch were as much colonists as the other powers of Europe in the vicinity. After a few weeks, your crew gets word that a squadron of 5 Portuguese ships has been raiding storehouses along the coast 2 days away further east along the island. Your ship and 3 others appointed to pursue the Portuguese and deal with them. You leave the port for the shallow coastal waters and the direction of the Portuguese. After just under 2 days of sailing, and now under a clear, starry sky, your ships spot the Portuguese moored in a U-shaped lagoon with a seaside cliff that forms a natural port. Bonfires along the shore mark the whereabouts of some of the Portuguese, indicating their ships are likely not fully manned. Your captain, André van Duin, relays a plan down the ranks to the rest of your crew. Your ship will be responsible for sending 3 small skiff boats loaded with alcohol toward their ships. You were volunteered to handle one of the skiffs, it was said, due to knowing how to swim. You find yourself shuffled into a small group of fellow crew members that will accompany you and the other 2 skiffs on your mission. Before you have time to protest, however, you are told of the plan. Captain van Duin's first officer, Henk Westbroek, explains the plan. You and the others are to swim alongside the skiffs, bringing them near to the Portuguese ships, light them on fire, and then push them into the swell and current heading in to the bay towards the enemy ships. You note the warmth of the water compared to the frigid North Sea waters back home and begin your swim alongside your skiff. After 20 to 30 odd minutes, you near a spot where the currents will pull the ships into the small bay and directly into the Portuguese ships. Signaling to the other 2 skiffs near you, you light yours and give it a small momentum push towards the entry of the bay swells. After a minute, you see the swift current taking your skiff exactly as planned, with triple the speed of your initial push right towards the enemy. Yours hits the closest and lead Portuguese ships, and as the fire caresses the port side of the ship and begins its climb up the hull, an alarm rings out. Whistles and yells accompanied by fast-moving torchlights indicating the other 2 skiffs and yours have been spotted, and soon the remaining 2 skiffs are thwarted by the Portuguese. You're now extremely tired and seem to be making little headway back to your ship. You risk being swept into the bay as your and the other Dutch ships approach, with cannons ready. If you don't make some type of progress, you risk being caught in the crossfire. You see only one other crew member with you in the water, but he is some distance away and appears to be caught in what you hope to avoid, the inlet of the bay. As the 2 lead Dutch ships sweep past the entrance of the bay, they let loose a barrage of cannon fire. The sound of cannonball shot echoes across the water, causing your ears to pound and then ring. You seem no closer to escaping the current as the cannonballs blast overhead past you, striking into the one Portuguese ship that was already burning, and a second just beside it. Soon, the shrill and terrifying screams of Portuguese crew members dying and injured replace the boom of the cannonballs, now splintering wood on both vessels. The lead Portuguese ship, which was already almost entirely engulfed in flames, suffers a hit to its main mast, which breaks in half and tumbles onto the deck, and the rest in the water below. Its capstan also blown completely apart. The second ship takes critical damage to its hull and quickly begins to take on water. A second barrage of cannon shot booms out across the water and again hits the same 2 Portuguese ships, with sickening thuds and crackles of even more splintering wood. You are now pulled into the swell and current and are only 30 or so feet away from these Portuguese ships. You feel an intense throbbing of pain suddenly hit your face and realize splinters from the wood of the ship have embedded along the right side of your face. The pain is excruciating, and just as the last few Dutch cannonballs ring out, you lose consciousness. When you awaken, it's back on board your ship in the patient quarters with your ship's surgeon looking down at you. You instinctively recoil in fear, and soon the throbbing pain of the splinter cuts threatens to see you again fall into unconsciousness. But you manage to hang on long enough to hear that the accompanying crew members all died except for you, and that the Portuguese surrendered after losing their 2 lead ships. You're told that just over 200 Portuguese crew were to be ransomed to the Portuguese to the north in India. You managed to capture that last bit of information before you again descend into darkness. This ends part 3. The 4th and final part of the series will deal with your return trip and the balance of your life. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like. If you've seen a few videos but haven't yet, please consider subscribing, and I'd love to hear your comments about this and other videos in the comments section below. As always, and until the next video, cheers. You have been recovering in the ship's recovery area, which has given you plenty of time to your own thoughts. You, as with the other sailors on board the ships, have a right to privilege, a per-sailor allotment for personal trade. Off-limits were goods the company traded, leaving room for creativity and, of course, illegality. Being your first trip, you had not taken goods with you for trade to acquire items to bring back on the return trip, so your only option was to trade against your wages. After a few weeks, you'd recovered enough to take an additional ship assignment. A portion of the ship's freight was to acquire goods in the lands known as India. Accompanying you and the rest of the crew was your close shipmate, Henk. Henk had an uncanny ability to see the positive of almost any situation, as well as turn the darkest and most dire situation into slapstick. In the midst of the doldrums, when morale was at its lowest and men were seemingly dying daily, he could be counted on for his grim and dire jokes and observations. Dying men, of course, no laughing matter, but when Henk spoke of them, suddenly it was. Many of the men died in prayer, with arms out, still clasped in holy communion with the Almighty. These men, many of them, had only found religion on their deathbed and had criminal rap sheets, likely longer than the Gospels themselves. Henk, however, joked that they were statues of piety sent to spread the Almighty's word to the fish and other denizens of the deep. Of course, knowing that all they would spread is debauchery and sin, and nothing holy, had the survivors doubled over in laughter. India was fascinating. The smell of the markets, rich in spices and herbs you'd never heard of, never mind smelled or tasted. You had thought Batavia was crowded, but the city you were in was as large as several European cities combined. A multitude of faiths and peoples mingled on the busy streets. In Batavia, you'd benefited from eating staples of home and admittedly had done very little experimentation with food outside of its walls. Here, you had no choice, and you relied on Henk, who had been here twice before, to show you the ropes and suggest you a nice mild dish reminiscent of starchy masses that you ate back home. However, upon eating a heaped fork of the stuff, your mouth immediately begins to scream with the pain of 1,000 eviscerated taste buds, tears flowing from your eyes as during your most despaired moments. Trying your best to not alarm the locals, you immediately heap your fork with the meat next to it. You hadn't tried it yet, and were hoping it would drown the burning sensation, which now had your tongue and gums as numb as if they had fallen asleep. However, your second bite, if anything, is hotter than the first, and still you try your best to keep the food down, as ship rules dictated that any sailor caught throwing food overboard or wasting it through any other means would be instantly flogged. And although you were on shore, those rules were drilled in you. Sweat is now pouring out of every hole in your body. Swallowing offers no relief. In fact, it only extended the trail of pain down into your stomach, which immediately begins to contract and heave upon receiving the contents. Your only option now was the drink that Hank called mawa flower liquor. Rather than provide any relief, the liquid you imbibe instantly inflames your already taxed taste buds with the most intense, searing sensation you've ever felt. It was the equivalent of throwing alcohol onto a fire. The last thing you remember prior to collapsing was the sick grin on Hank's face. You periodically have a brief moment of lucidity. Hank and a fellow sailor propping you between them, your feet dragging toes first into the soft soil at the side of the buildings. Another brief moment has you heaving the contents of your stomach, strained first through your beard hair and then down your tunic and trousers. Another moment has you feeling the contents spilling out your rear in a powerful liquid jet of searing pain and discomfort. You wake up what feels like days later on a grassy knoll overlooking the market with Hank and the other crewmen laughing hysterically. You try your best to maintain some dignity with a display of anger, but upon seeing how completely and utterly you have soiled yourself from every orifice, well, it has you joining in on the laughter with the men. The company had rules for privilege to dissuade trade of goods that they had a monopoly on, for without the VOC there would be no ships and most men abided by the rules. Or to put more appropriately, most men had the noblest of intentions for following those rules, at least early on. Months at sea and dwindling wages eroded those intentions. The resulting interpretation by many was that goods, no matter how illegal, were sanctioned. Of course, the sailor that was caught with the contraband faced a flogging and harsh wage fines. Given you were fairly certain this would be your last trip to the east, and with the aforementioned dwindling resources, you decide to throw caution to the wind. While you hadn't tried it yet, you knew that opium was extremely sought after back home, as it relieved pain and many other manners of illness. You purchased as much as you could fit into your leather drinking pouch, an amount you believe would be enough to purchase a home upon your return. What you hadn't anticipated was the check by VOC Customs once back in Batavia. You see the customs employees checking the crewmen already dockside and the skiff ahead of you carefully. You tell Hank in desperation what you had done. Thinking fast, he ties a thin support line to the satchel, weights it with some lead shot, and hangs it overboard, where it immediately sinks to the end of the line's length. You feel a sense of relief, which is immediately dispelled upon seeing the same customs employees lifting a string like your own on that same skiff ahead of you. Hank tells you to make a mental note of where we are and when close, as he will cut the line. With just seconds to spare, as you pull up dockside, he cuts the line and your profit with it to the hopefully shallow depths below. 2 men on your skiff with contraband are immediately led away in custody, but you, Hank, and the others pass through without incident. Hank pulls his own contraband from the lower portion of his backside, proud at himself for evading capture of said goods. That same evening, you spend 3 hours desperately diving at the dock to the bottom of the waters, your lungs barely able to hold on to the air at the depth of 5 to 7 meters. However, you are able to retrieve the goods within a few hours. Had you not been curious by nature, you likely could have kept the opium out of sight and mind until returning to Amsterdam to turn a healthy profit for yourself and purchase that planned home for you and a future family. Alas, the same inquisitiveness that brought you to the VOC has you deciding to sample the wares on the first night. Imbibing it as per the merchant's instructions has you immediately brought to a hallowed and warm, comfortable embrace of comfort, love, and nostalgia, your body tingling with positivity, and you cannot help but smile at everything and anything around you. Some nausea has you purging what was left of any food you ate that day, but then you're back to enjoying the sensation of this amazing substance. As you return to physical labor, of ship's crew duties, you decide to sample a little bit more. Never has the work been this effortless or time passed this quickly as it did under the influence of the poppy's milk. Even the most dull task suddenly takes on a vibrant, happy, and fulfilled intensity. Soon, it's a day here and a day there, turning into daily use. 3 weeks later, you forget your daily dose one day and have to work without it. At first, the discomfort is limited to profuse sweating, then cramps, then liquid purging out your backside. Within a few hours, your body feels as if it weighs as heavy as a cannon, and you feel like an old man schlepping your carcass about the ship's decks. Later, upon returning to the crew quarters in Batavia, you take a dose, and immediately, within minutes, you feel well again. Your ship is to be loaded in Batavia for its return journey back to the homeland. Although in a daily haze, the thought of home fills you with nostalgia. Never had the thought of your farm life or the flat, wet, and cold lands of your birth elicited such emotion and longing in you. The return journey itself, though, is not something that the crew are looking at favorably. The voyage here had taken its toll on all of you, and those who died at sea were replaced by VOC personnel from Batavia, seeking to return home as well. Some of them at the end of their service tenures, others with verbal confirmation of new treaties and trade to discuss back in Amsterdam. The loading work is back-breaking physical labor, and the hot Batavian sun only adds to the grueling nature of the work. Even Henk's humor has been somewhat dulled by the toiling nature of the work at hand. Some days later, your ship is fully loaded, but your supply of opium perilously low. After a day, the feeling of sickness is so intense you are doubled over and writhing in pain, every vein and artery in your body feeling itchy and your muscles extremely twitchy and thrashing out wildly on their own. You have a plan. You're going to borrow some of your surgeon's opium supplies. Again, the most noble of intentions turns into something else, because your plan fails almost as quickly as you had formulated it, with you making enough noise in the surgeon's quarters to wake up half the fleet. Catching you rifling through his drawers, Fontaine angrily grabs you by the forearm and yells out for assistance. You plead with him, but within seconds, the ship's guards are inside and you in chains. Recognizing the reason for your sickness, Fontaine, likely more angry that you dared steal from his supply than angry at the theft itself. For a week that feels like eternity, you are chained in the ship's holding cell. Recovering from the poppy sickness feels worse than any sickness or discomfort you've ever felt in your life. You're barely fed, but all the same, as you have essentially no appetite, and what little you have eaten doesn't stay down for long. In the interim, the officers on behalf of the captain have decided your fate. You are to run the gauntlet. The running of the gauntlet was one of the VOC punishments for theft on board a ship. Admittedly, it was one of the milder punishments, as death could and was doled out for more extreme instances of theft. The running of the gauntlet was a punishment that dated back to Roman times and was still used by both military and naval organizations in the known world, i.e. the VOC or English India Company. It involved stripping the person sentenced to their waist. They were then to run between two rows of soldiers, or in this instance, company officers and other crew members, who would lash out at the person with a modified cat-o'-nine tails. The only difference with the naval version of the punishment was that it involved not just a dash through 2 rows of soldiers, but around the ship's decks a number of prescribed times. To ensure a steady pace for the accused, a company officer with a sword walked just in front of the person, preventing them from dashing past. Once the person had completed the run, their punishment was deemed carried out, as was their payment for the crime. The reason for this was that the crew member, having paid for their crime rather quickly, albeit painfully, was of more use as a functional crew member than rotting in a cell, where he was of no use to anyone. You are still queasy and a bit nauseous from the poppy sickness, but are led up to the deck where your fellow crew members are waiting for you. Every second one is armed with a cat-o'-nine-tails, while the others strike out at you with hand, foot, and the pommel of their swords. As the signal is given, you feel the first lashes striking you on your back and left arm. Blood almost immediately drawn, now pouring down your backside and arms. The pain is intense, and every instinct in you is screaming and begging for you to run and move faster, but your pace is kept deliberately slow by the aforementioned officer in front of you. The pain soon becomes so intense, you feel yourself that familiar feeling of blacking out, but still you struggle forward, as failure would only mean a continuation of the beatings given. While many of those lashing out at you were under normal circumstances shipmates, acquaintances, and even friends, they were expected to not hold back, as the perception of doing so could mean equal punishment for them. After your second circuit, and with most of your body throbbing and heaving with painful nerve twitches, all while glazed in a thick layer of your own blood, you're given the signal to stop, and you collapse almost immediately to the deck. You're helped back to your feet by your crewmates, who drag you to the domain of your favorite ship's crew member, the surgeon, Fontaine. To prevent infections on open wounds when at sea, the surgeons would first rinse the recently punished with salty ocean water before massing thick chunks of salt into the gaping wounds. Again, your pain senses spike at the salt touching the open wounds, and you howl out in pain. After a few more days, you rejoin the crew in your daily tasks, but you still need time to heal completely. The beauty of the sea voyages such as this was that you had more time than you knew what to do with. Eventually the wounds healed closed, leaving only the scars which, like a macabre set of tattoos, marked out your recent punishment in full display for all to see. As the weeks on board the ship fold into months, you continue your voyage back home to the Dutch fatherland. Your stamina, now hardened from almost 2 years at sea, fares better on the return trip, but still, there are many casualties along the way. After 3 seasons, your ship arrives at the North Sea and begins its meandering up the coast of the Republic before turning south of Texel towards the inland sea and Amsterdam. The site of Amsterdam, so long an unremembered dream, now lies once again majestically before you. Gentle wind rocking the many ships at its port as church bells ring out, signaling noontime. The VOC sailors returning to Amsterdam were often called Lords of 6 weeks, as this was the approximate amount of time it took these men to squander and flaunt their sudden wealth. You receive the balance of your pay and spend the first night celebrating with your friend Hank. Hank, possessing his pay, starts the festivities off with what looks to be a barrel of gin. After 2 hours, Hank and you stumble out of the tavern, only to look for a new place to stay until the wee hours of the morning. Hank, who is more inebriated than you have ever seen him, orders a coach not only for you both, but another for his pipe and tobacco box, and a third coach for his hat. You and Hank and your small caravan of coaches clomps throughout the cobblestone streets, stopping at various taverns where you sample their house best before departing for the next. Daylight eventually greets you both, and finally you retire at an inn. The act of the night before is repeated for many more nights, which then blend into weeks, until the gnawing realization hits you that your funds have been all but spent. The next few weeks sees you returning to your family's farm, where you assist your father and mother, and never again venture out and beyond the VOC shipping lanes. You would, however, travel via land to some of the other countries surrounding the Republic, including the Flemish lands to the south, where you would meet your future wife. You receive word that Henk, having sailed again with the VOC, has died, but no cause other than service to the VOC is given. In time, you have several kids, but becoming a grandparent is something that you would not be destined to go on to do. In your 4th decade, you die tending the fields of your farm on a cold and unremarkable December day. The gravestone marking your life still visible in the Gouderok Cemetery. This marks the end of life on board a VOC trade ship in the 17th century. I really hope you've enjoyed this series. I've got some exciting content in store for the next first-person series, which will focus on the Aztec culture. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. As always, and until the next video, cheers.